Hello and welcome to The Top Story, the podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Xizhi. Coming up in this edition, European leaders have held a second emergency security meeting on Ukraine in face of growing pressure from Washington, announcing a new round of sanctions on Moscow. Hamas has proposed exchanging all remaining Israeli and Palestinian prisoners in one go during the second phase of the Gaza ceasefire. And anxiety grips the capital of the Democratic Republic of the Congo as M23 rebels continue to advance in the east, with fears of a possible coup attempt in Kinshasa. We begin in Europe. More leaders on the continent are calling for immediate action to support Ukraine in the face of growing pressure from Washington. They've held a second emergency security meeting in Paris, which Canada also attended. After the meeting, French President Emmanuel Macron said the position of France and its partners on Ukraine is clear and united. Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson criticized U.S. President Donald Trump's use of the word dictator to call Ukraine's president, while German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock called Trump's comments absurd. But the question of deploying troops to Ukraine still hangs in the balance, as German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius said it was too early to talk about it. EU envoys have also agreed on the 16th package of sanctions against Russia. Ross Cullen reports from Paris.
Package of sanctions from the European Union announced the 16th such package since February 2022, when Russia launched this full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And some of the details of what's in that package of sanctions is going to be a targeting of the Shadow Fleet vessels. Now, these are ships which are believed by Europe to be used by Russia, but they aren't under a Russian flag. They're not officially registered or acknowledged by Russia that they are naval vessels or that they are maritime vessels, but they are used by Russia, according to Europe, to sabotage things such as cables running between different countries in the Baltic Sea. They are on the receiving end of some of these sanctions. Also, export bans on chemicals and some products used in machines, a ban on servicing oil and gas refineries, ban on imports of Russian aluminium as well. And just to note, there won't be a ban yet, according to the European Union, on imports of Russian LNG, but they do want to wean themselves off liquefied natural gas coming from Russia as soon as possible. They would like to start importing huge quantities of LNG from the United States, and certainly on a deal front and a transactional front, that would be something that would be of interest to President Trump as well.
That was Ross Cullen in Paris. Russian President Vladimir Putin has praised the outcome of talks between Russian and US officials in Riyadh. Putin also said Ukraine would not be excluded from negotiations to end the ongoing conflict.
His theory is inappropriate. As far as the negotiation process is concerned, I was told by the president during a telephone conversation that, of course, the United States assumes that the negotiation process will take place with the participation of both Russia and Ukraine. No one is excluding Ukraine from the process. The goal and the subject of our talks was to restore Russian-American relations. If anyone wants to be an intermediary between Russia and the United States, it's probably an excessive demand.
The Russian president also said the goal and the subject of Tuesday's talks was the restoration of Russia-US relations. Dasha Chinicheva has more from Moscow.
Assessment at the Kremlin is that those talks in Saudi Arabia have been quite important, and they have served as the first and very important stepping stone into the further reconstruction of bilateral relations between Moscow and Washington, and also the further talks on Ukraine. Now, the Russian president has said that Moscow is willing to return to the negotiating table when it comes to the issue of Ukraine. He has said Moscow has never rejected those negotiations, stressing once again that it is the European countries and Ukraine that have been refusing to talk to Moscow, as well as the previous administration of Joe Biden. He also has stressed that there should be no hysteria, as he described it, in Kiev with regards to Kiev being left outside the talks between Russia and the United States, especially in Saudi Arabia, because those talks, according to the Russian president, were primarily about Russian-American relations. And he stressed that in the further negotiations on Ukraine, Ukraine should be present. At the same time, what he has said is that increasing the bilateral trust between Russia and the United States could serve as a very important issue when it comes to finding the long-term settlement on the conflict in Ukraine. And he, the Russian president, in his interpretation, said that Trump, when came to the Oval Office, realized that it was much more complex to resolve the conflict in Ukraine and would take more than just days or weeks, as he has been saying before. So at this stage, the Russian side is saying that the negotiations on Ukraine should be arranged, and we understand in Russia and the United States there will be negotiating teams with the chief negotiators from Russia yet to be appointed, and Moscow will be looking at who will be representing the American side. So in this context, we understand any trust reinforcing measures between Moscow and Washington will be paving the way towards the settlement on Ukraine.
That was Dasha Chinisheva in Moscow. Staying in Europe, the World Trade Organization has called on its member states to stay calm in the face of uncertainties and remember to uphold the WTO principles and rules. This comes after China raised the issue of new tariffs imposed by the United States at the WTO General Council meeting in Geneva. In a letter to the new U.S. Commerce Secretary, Chinese Commerce Minister Wang Wentao expressed dissatisfaction with the U.S. decision to impose additional tariffs on all Chinese goods. Wang congratulated Howard Lutnick on his appointment, but said China hopes to address the concerns through equal dialogue and consultation. Wang said China is willing to create a fair and predictable policy environment for cooperation between business communities. Julia Lubova reports from Geneva.
The General Council of the World Trade Organization has convened for the first time this year in Geneva. On the agenda, U.S. tariffs against its trading partners, including China. China's ambassador to the WTO said that the world is facing a series of tariff shocks. China said, quote, U.S. tariffs unilaterally and arbitrarily blatantly violate WTO rules and that China firmly opposes such measures, quote ends. The General Council meeting was held behind closed doors in Geneva, but according to the WTO spokesperson, who briefed reporters after the meeting, 32 member states spoke on the issue. That includes Canada and the EU. The Trump administration has increased tariffs on imports from Canada, Mexico and China and has threatened reciprocal tariffs against goods from the EU.
The reaction, the tone was pretty constructive, and as I said, the large majority of members really stressed the importance of upholding the WTO principle and rules. They collectively called for actions to preserve the stability and the effectiveness of the system. And the DG said that, the Director General said that the WTO was exactly created to manage times like this, and she called on members to use the WTO as a platform to find a solution.
The US announced 10% tariffs on all Chinese imports. Beijing has already filed a WTO dispute against Washington. China says that these tariffs, quote, heighten economic uncertainty, disrupt global trade and risk domestic inflation, market distortion or even global recession, quote ends. The WTO is calling on member states to maintain a cool head in the time of uncertainty, reinforce the importance of the WTO and remain open to dialogue.
That was Julia Lubova in Geneva. Turning to the Middle East, Hamas has proposed exchanging all remaining Israeli and Palestinian prisoners in one go during the second phase of the Gaza ceasefire. Its aim is to reach a permanent truce and a full Israeli pullout. At the same time, Hamas has rejected Israel's call to disarm and leave Gaza. Israel says negotiations for the second stage of the ceasefire deal will happen this week. Reports say Palestinian armed groups have handed over the bodies of 4 Israeli hostages killed in the Gaza Strip during the Israeli war to a team of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Another 6 hostages still alive will be released on Saturday. Jonathan Regev has the latest from Tel Aviv.
Israel, of course, was happy to have all 6 hostages returned this Saturday instead of waiting another week. There's actually a lot of criticism in Israel on the government, saying, why do Israelis have to wait every time for another week and another week instead of bringing all the people, all the living people at once? The conditions were known. Israel was ready, was able and ready to release the Palestinian prisoners in much bigger numbers in order to have everybody back together. Now it seems to finally be happening. 6 hostages, which are the last remaining hostages in the first phase, are meant to be back home on Saturday, and Israelis are generally very happy with this, as the whole feeling here was that all of the hostages, alive and not alive, in the first stage, all of them could have been brought back at a much earlier stage. Now, finally.
That was Jonathan Regev in Tel Aviv. In Africa, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, President Felix Tshisekedi's office says the army is still in control of Bukavu, contradicting reports the country's second-largest city in the eastern region has fallen to M23 rebels. The humanitarian situation in conflict areas is worsening. In Kinshasa, there are fears of a possible coup attempt. Caroline B. reports.
After seizing Goma, the capital of North Kivu, M23 fighters advanced to the neighboring province of South Kivu. On Friday, witnesses said they entered Bukavu, a city of 1.3 million people, and began patrolling the streets. Reports soon emerged that they had seized it. However, President Felix Tshisekedi's office has refuted the reports, saying his army and allied forces are still in control of the strategic hub. Despite this, the unrest in the east is being felt thousands of miles away in the capital, Kinshasa. Amid reports of a possible coup, news agency Reuters says some residents are looking to move their families abroad. It added that 3 Kinshasa-based government officials were making arrangements to get their families out of the country. It further reports that embassies are now using armored vehicles and sending some staff to Brazzaville, the capital of the Republic of the Congo. The country's Justice Ministry said on social platform X that Congolese will not accept any coup that involves the Rwandan army to destabilize the country's institutions. Rwanda has always rejected allegations from the DRC and the United Nations that it supports M23 with arms and troops. Diplomatic efforts to stop the conflict have stalled. President Tshisekedi continues to refuse to negotiate with the M23, with his team blaming the international community for failing to stand up to Rwanda by imposing sanctions. Tshisekedi also skipped 2 peace meetings this month, a joint summit of the Southern and East African leaders in Tanzania and African Union Summit in Addis Ababa. Instead, the Congolese president traveled to the just concluded Munich Security Conference, where he accused his predecessor, Joseph Kabila, of sponsoring the M23's military campaign, allegations which Kabila's camp denied. His move drew a backlash from Congolese politicians. Martin Fayulu, an opposition leader in the DRC, said Tshisekedi did not understand the issues of the country and was not fit to lead. Meanwhile, the humanitarian situation in the east is worsening amid the fighting. Since the capture of Bukavu, the UN Refugee Agency says between 10 and 15,000 people have crossed into neighboring Burundi in recent days. The United Nations Rights Office in Geneva has said conditions are deteriorating sharply for civilians caught up in the fighting in eastern DRC. It has reported abuses, including summary executions and sexual violence.
That was Caroline B. on the latest from the DRC. Finally, in North America, U.S. federal workers are protesting the Trump administration's medical research cuts on layoffs at the National Institutes of Health in Washington, D.C. This comes as the White House and the Department of Government Efficiency try to fire new and career federal government employees. Earlier, Trump also targeted the Federal Aviation Administration, even as authorities investigate multiple airplane disasters. Benji Haya reports from Washington.
Yeah, another day of protest action here in Washington, D.C. At the Department of Health behind me, demonstrators gathered earlier to protest against what could be hundreds of redundancies and potential funding cuts for the National Institutes of Health. That's after President Donald Trump instructed the NIH to reduce its budget due to what he calls wasteful spending. Last year, the NIH did hand out grants of up to $35 billion, a huge amount of money, of course, but the scientific community say that cuts of up to 15% of that could be devastating for the sort of critical research that we're seeing into cancer treatments or pandemic prevention, that life-saving effort, also putting the United States at the forefront of biomedical research, competing often with the likes of China. The latest is that 22 state attorneys have tried to bring this battle to court to try to legally stop, pause, prevent the Trump administration's health changes, and that has so far been upheld by a judge who has temporarily paused the latest moves. But this is just one part of the administration's health blitz. For example, the newly confirmed Health Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., announcing a series of cuts to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. He, a vaccine critic, a conspiracy theorist, wants to, in his words, make America healthy again. This is just one part of a more widespread effort to overhaul the federal government as we know it. And it is Elon Musk, the billionaire businessman, the unelected advisor to Donald Trump, who is leading that charge. And next up in his crosshairs is the Department of Defense. There could be hundreds of redundancies there. The Pentagon, of course, the largest government department, eyes too for his Department of Government Efficiency on the Federal Aviation Administration. There are being cuts at that department, even though there had been a spate of plane crashes, fatal plane crashes, across the United States recently. And then there's this, the Agriculture Department say they are trying to rehire some individuals that they just recently fired, trying to bring them back in because they were leading the federal government's response to the outbreak of avian flu. This is not, by the way, something that is just affecting workers here in the nation's capital. About 80% of the departments where employees are impacted are happening all across the rest of the country. Elon Musk is defending his cost-cutting agenda. He says that this is about trying to restore democracy in the face of bureaucracy, and he claims that his Doge team is being transparent, putting out all the data, and that may very well be true, but some keen-eyed social media users have spotted that some of that data is incorrect. One contract to the tune of $8 billion, says Doge, actually turned out to be more like 8 million. 3 zeros off the end.
That was Benji Hire on the latest round of government job cuts in the US. Now, recapping the headlines, European leaders have held a second emergency security meeting on Ukraine in the face of growing pressure from Washington. Hamas has proposed exchanging all remaining Israeli and Palestinian prisoners in one go during the second phase of the Gaza ceasefire. And anxiety is gripping the capital of the Democratic Republic of the Congo as M23 rebels continue to advance in the east. And that's it for this edition of The Top Story, the podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to the Beijing Hour, a 1-hour podcast news magazine program. We welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Qi Zhi. Thank you for listening.